Meena Ahmed has written a book called Indian Genius, and the subtitle is Key, The Meteoric Rise of Indians in America. I needed this book. I hate to start with a cliche, some of my best friends are, but it's true. I mean, there's a major Indian community, an Indian American community in Atlanta and in cities all over the country, and they often hold positions that have involved higher education, in the tech field, in medicine. My doctor is Indian, so I really wanted to, I feel like I know more about the Indian community than Indian Americans do after reading your book, just to let you know. So I do want to say that Meena, who came over here from India in 1970, this is not her first book. Her previous book was on foreign relations, and that's where your training was, really, in your studies, from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, correct? Right. And Meena is a journalist. Her previous book, A Matter of Trust, India-U.S. Relations from Truman to Trump, which is the perfect other book to read right now because we saw the conflagration between India and Pakistan just last month, and it's incredible to have that perspective. It was a finalist for the Council of Foreign Relations Book Award, and I have to read you from the New York Times, exquisite, this was from the New York Times Book Review, exquisitely written, thoroughly researched and insightful account of the twists and turns in the 75-year relationship between India and the United States, and it added perceptive and even-handed, which is why we can trust journalists like Meena Ahmed. So Meena, welcome to Nantucket.
Thank you so much.
So this meteoric rise, I mean, there are a couple of numbers, like how meteoric is it? Just give us a couple of numbers to put it in perspective from the time you came to our shores to now.
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for having me in this beautiful place, Nantucket, and thank you very much to Mary Haft for creating this festival, which is just so unique of all the book festivals that I've been to. When I came here in 1970, there were 50,000 Indians in the country, hardly, a drop in the bucket. Today, there are about 5 million, and that is almost 1% of the population. So the big rise, the big influx came after 2000 during the tech boom. So 65% of the Indians you see here were born in India and came after that whole Y2K scare, when everyone felt they needed Indian techies to solve their problem.
But even before that, that first impetus, I mean, you can start the story in a lot of places from the many profiles you've done, great profiles of many of the most successful Indians in America. But I'm fascinated with that first, the prime mover, who was the first prime minister of India, who made a decision on how he was going to get this country out of poverty. Let us know about that.
So, immigration in this country is a big topic of conversation these days. My book is a little bit of the counter-argument, which is, what contributions people have made. So if you think about it, what is American exceptionalism? I just want to spend a minute on that. What is really, truly unique about the US is that it's a country of immigrants. I think that unless you're Native American, almost every single person in this room, whether you go back 1 generation, 5 generations, 3 generations, you will find that you have people in your family that came from somewhere. And every wave, whether it was the Irish or the Greeks or the Italians, everyone contributed something to this country, and that has made this country great. The Indians are just the most recent immigrants, and my book is about their contributions. But really, when you look at it, this is a country which really has excelled because of all the talent that we've been able to attract to the shores. And so I think that you know, there are very few countries in the world that have done what America has done. So really, I think it is what binds us all. Every one of us has that in common, that we have people who came from somewhere else. It's something that should really unite us, not divide us. And and I think that if we look at it in a positive way, I think maybe people can have a different perspective on what's going on today. But having said that, let me talk about the Indians. So the Indians are interesting in one regard, that they seem to have done it in one generation, many of them. The second thing that's interesting is that they have the highest per capita income in this country, higher even than the white population, the ethnic white population. They have the highest levels of education in this country. So this is all part of my book, and it's according to the Pew Research and the U.S. Census. So Indians have done remarkably well in this environment, and we can talk a little bit about why and how. What I chose to do, because there are a lot of wealthy Indians in this country, and that didn't interest me. What interested me was, where are the areas where Indians have had a truly remarkable impact, and where they've been able to change people's thinking or really contributed in some way. And I divided it up into 3 areas: tech, medicine, and public policy. And among them, I chose 5 individuals in each section that illustrated to me exceptional, innovative, transformational people who have changed the landscape in some way. Because I wanted you to get to know them. Everyone wants to know how do people become successful? I mean, we're all curious about how did people get to where they are? Well, these people tell you in their own words how they got to the top. What were their obstacles? What were their inspirations? And I sort of wanted to get out of the way and be able to bring them to you. So I limited to 5 people each.
And before we get to the reason they could even dream about getting to the top starts with Prime Minister Nehru in, was it the late 40s,
yes.
right after Indian independence from Great Britain?
So there was a push-pull. Sometimes immigration is driven by different things, and in this country there were 2 things that drove certainly the immigrants from India coming in. One was in 1965, which is when they relaxed the immigration rules. President Johnson had passed the Medicare Act. So all of a sudden, you had 20 million Americans who now had access to health care. So the hospitals were sort of overwhelmed. It was the same time when the Vietnam War happened, and they needed to ship out more doctors, and they were getting a lot more wounded people coming in. So the system was under stress. They didn't have the medical personnel. And at the same time, the AMA in all its wisdom decided to limit and downsize how many medical students should graduate. So what did the hospitals do? They went overseas and looked for people who were qualified and who were qualified in English speaking. The second thing that happened was an internationally driven need, which was Sputnik had happened. And the Russians, the US military was petrified that the Russians were going to win the space war. The Cold War had just begun. And so the US military began investing huge amounts of money up and down the East and West Coast, and MIT and Stanford and Caltech, and putting a lot of money into military research, but there weren't enough engineers. So 10,000 miles away, to get to Michael's very, very interesting question, India became independent just after, in 1947, and the prime minister was very visionary, the first prime minister, who actually had a very close friendship with Jackie Kennedy. He decided that the way to bring India out of poverty was through science, technology, and education, and he had invested heavily in establishing engineering institutes and medical institutes in the country. And he'd done this in collaboration with different countries. So there was something, I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT, there's been quite a lot written up about them. But if anyone's been to MIT, there's just no way you wouldn't know about it because half the students there went, a third of the students who are Indian went there. And these were centers of really outstanding world-class engineering institutes that were done in collaboration. One was with Germany, one was with the US, one was with the UK, etc. So there were 5 of them. And they were graduate.
And is that because India was too poor to set them up without some kind of partnership?
Well, they wanted them to be world-class. So they needed some funding, and B, they needed the sort of professors to collaborate with Indian professors and do some research. So they were graduating their classes just about the time in the 60s. The first lot that was graduating just when the US had this incredible deficit in both doctors and engineers, and India didn't have the absorptive capacity to give them the jobs they wanted or for them to do further research, because they didn't have the funds and they didn't have the facilities. So they were looking to come here. So it was a perfect match. So the US just went and recruited all these very smart people, very well educated, and they brought a whole lot of them in. And so the Indians that came into this country were sort of very highly qualified during the 60s and 70s. You had to get into this country, you had to have STEM skills. So that is why you had this huge influx, and it was a very good match.
And highly qualified is almost an understatement when I read the rigors of what it takes to get into the Indian Institutes of Technology.
Yes, it's sort of like 1 million people apply for 10,000 spaces, and it's harder to get into MIT. MIT is a backup plan for a lot of Indians. Yeah, it's true.
And so this has to affect, I always come at things from a parenting perspective. I have 3 grown children. It's got to affect parenting in a country like India where the competition is so fierce. Is there some kind of through line in terms of the people who made it to those institutes and then came over here and then reached the top?
So competition in India is intense. And one of the attributes people talk about, how did these people become successful and what does it take to be a genius? And competition is one of the being able to compete. Indians are trained to compete from day one, to get into, when you live in a country of 1.5 billion people, failure is not an option. You look around and there's poverty, and you know that that's not who you want to be. Parents are very obsessed about education and about giving their kids the best education they can provide. You're competing for everything in India, whether it's a gas connection, whether it's getting into schools, whether it's, getting on a bus, it's just everything. You're competing with lots of other people.
What's it like to get on a bus?
So, there's this one person who says, in my interviews with him, he says, we all have something called jugaad. It's an Indian term, which is, it's not genius, but there's no translation for it, but it's being able to invent your way out of things and to be able to be creative and to really have a drive. And so when a bus, for example, comes, they won't stop at the bus stop. They'll stop like 2 feet away. So only the most aggressively, the most muscular people can get on because they race to the bus and then they have to push their way through the crowds to get on a bus. It's just one small example of how everything in India, it's a fight to get something. And when these early people came, they had no one here. There was no one here to help them. They really came on the strength of their education and their brilliance and So because if they failed, no one was going to bail them out. And so these people were very, very hardworking and smart, and they succeeded.
And that, that risk of failure and what that means, and staring the poverty in the face. It's interesting because reading your book, it seemed like Indian parents over there were sort of averse to risk. It's like, and so there was that pull and tug.
Well, you have this, so it's an interesting dichotomy, because a lot of people have asked, what does it take to become a genius? You have the Gladwell theory of 10,000 hours if you put in. Any child can become a perfect violinist. But then you have Angela Duckworth, who will say, yes, but you have to be passionate about something, because if you're not passionate, you're never going to achieve really the top level. So you can be good at something, excel at something, but to be truly great at something, you have to have a passion for the subject. So I'll give you a small example. Have you heard of the spelling bee? Okay, so, and if you've heard of the spelling bee, you probably know that the last 7 spelling bees, except for one, has been won by Indian kids. And it's gotten to the point where it's so ridiculous that, 7 of the finalists were Indian. Now, why is this? So Indian parents who come here are totally obsessed with their kids doing the spelling bee. So I started looking into this, and actually my publisher initially wanted me to write a book on the spelling bee. And I was like, I thought about it, and there's been a couple of things, there's been articles written about it, there's even been a documentary. But I thought that, okay, I talked to a few people, some Indians, a couple of people whose children had done the math bee, and I realized I'd have to embed myself with these families, get to know them, and being Indian, they would feed me and treat me like one of their own, and then I'd end up having to write this awful book talking about how the parents drive their children insane. And I just thought I couldn't do it because they would feel so betrayed. And I thought, okay, that is an interesting book, but it's not for me to write that book. Someone else is going to have to do that book, because there's no way I could go into people's homes and eat their food and live with their kids and then dish on them. So I thought...
we have a lot of authors who come here. Mary Kay, are there any authors who might want to take on that book? Because that sounds like a good book.
But I thought, I'm not going to do that. But anyway, so I did, and I thought the story was so much bigger than that. You have people like Satya Nadella, who's running Microsoft, and you have, the guy who runs Adobe, and they're all Indian, and you have... there's so many people like Nikki Haley, and there was a bigger story to be told about why these people have done so well. So, but to go back to the spelling bee just for a minute, all these parents felt who came after 2000, they brought their sort of competitive spirit with them, and they felt that they didn't want their kids to become soft in America and become sort of loosey-goosey and start watching too much TV and playing video games and, just having fun. They said, how do we maintain this competitive spirit amongst our children? Well, they found this platform, this competitive platform of the spelling bee, so they all started driving their kids to do spelling bee, the math bee, the geographic bee, and they started winning all these competitions. And they not only try out for the big spelling bee, they now have like hundreds of chapters in the US where they have Indian parents who have Indian communities, community centers, where they do practice spelling bees and compete amongst themselves and intra-city competitions before they get to the spelling bee. That's why they're winning, right? And there was one dad who was an engineer who put out 300,000 words that his kid had to study, and everyone in the family, mom did the laundry, the sister was doing practices with him on all the words. They got him a Greek tutor, Latin tutor to get all the derivatives and the origins of all the words. And guess what he stumbled on? He stumbled on the word Darjeeling. I mean, you should have seen the parents' face because it was on video. And, he must have opened his kitchen door, multiple times, the kitchen cabinet, and every Indian has tea in their closet, and they all have Darjeeling tea somewhere written, in black and white, and, he stumbled on. It's just that here was this kid who was being taught everything, but just common sense things, like, he hadn't observed his own household. And so and the parents were like, oh my God. And so, you realize that, that you can't push the kids who have actually won have been kids who have somehow had an interest in words or something from day one. And I thought to myself, okay, all these parents have spent this enormous amount of time on the spelling bee and making them competitive. What do these kids end up doing? Do they end up becoming a genius after all this practice? I mean, what is the goal? Is it, developing good studying skills, and do they go on and compete? So I did a kind of matrix. Now, some of them are too young, they're still in college. But, one had, a few of them had become doctors and engineers, and one had become a poker player. They're all perfectly respectable, professions to go into, but they might have done that regardless, being brought up in an Indian household where that's encouraged. But none of them had won any awards. None of them were on some kind of genius track to winning the Nobel Prize. So I realized that, all of this pushing your children didn't actually lead to genius. One of the things I discovered when I talked to all these people like Satya Nadella, actually got rejected at the famous IIT, as did the head of Adobe, Shantanu Narayan. They didn't get in. And yet they made it. And they are leading major Fortune 500 companies. So you have to ask yourself, is that, push for competition, is that really that important? And I discovered almost every one of the people I interviewed will tell you that their parents never pushed them to study or to choose a profession or put any pressure on them. They had the freedom to pursue their interest. And they were so motivated that it was their motivation that led them to doing whatever they did. So, so that contradicts really the theory that you should be sitting over your kid with, I mean, you do need, I do think you need the hours, the Malcolm Gladwell hours, because if you look at Bill Gates, you look at Bill Joy, you look at Steve Jobs, and even if you look at Satya Nadella and Shantanu Narayan, once their interest clicked, they were just obsessed with computers, or they were obsessed with what they were doing. And they did put in those hours not because their parents told them to, or not in school necessarily. Steve Jobs dropped out, but so did Bill Gates, but they were obsessed with what they were doing. And they would spend hours and hours and hours and weekends doing it. So you do have to have the hours, but it doesn't do you much good if you don't have the passion.
I can't get the image of the spelling bee kid becoming a doctor. It's like your cholesterol is ELEVATED. Is that how it happens? But it's interesting because we're talking certainly over many of these years, mostly about young men coming over here, and I'm really particularly fascinated with the women who have come over here and made it big despite the traditional expectations of what their role was in society. Just give us a couple of stories about, is there something different about the women?
Well, in the old days, if you were going to send someone overseas, one, you were going to put your resources into the male child, because in the 50s, not in the 50s, the immigration laws relaxed in 1965, but in the 60s and 70s, it was still more traditional. Also, people didn't trust their daughter going overseas because they were worried about, who was going to look after her, and what was, was she going to go out and date and go out with boys? I mean, that was the big fear. And so, so there were all these sort of constraints about women. But even in India, so you're referring, I think
Chandrika
Michael is
Tandon.
referring to someone who's on the face of this book. There's Nikki Haley, who many of you know. There's also Chandrika Tandon. And some of you may have heard of her. Some of you may not have heard of her. You may have heard of her more famous sister, Indra Nooyi, who ran Pepsi. So Chandrika grew up in a very traditional South Indian Brahmin household, and she had to go on a hunger strike just to be able to go to a co-ed college. I mean, she had to struggle to get an education even in India, because her mother's goal for her was to get married. And
for both of the sisters.
For both of the sisters, but she, being the elder one, got most of the heat. But here's Chandrika, and the reason I have her on the cover and not her sister Indra Nooyi, and I've been asked about this, is I'll just give you a little brief summary of her achievements, and you tell me what you think. Indra Nooyi had come here for her graduate school, and then she went to Boston Consulting, and then she moved to Pepsi, and rose up the hierarchy, and she became CEO. Now, it's incredible for an Indian woman to become a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, especially, in 2006 or whatever. It was remarkable. And it's no small achievement. But just let's look at her sister for a minute. Her sister was working for Citibank in India, and devised a cost-benefit analysis on how to evaluate risk on a balance sheet that Citibank thought was so innovative, and she was in her 20s, that they sent her to New York to teach the people in New York how to do it. When she was in New York, she was discovered by McKinsey. Someone told McKinsey about her. So McKinsey interviewed her and recruited her. And when she came and joined McKinsey, she became the first Indian woman partner at McKinsey. Now, most people would have thought, oh, I'm a partner at McKinsey. I'm earning this great salary. I mean, that's great. I can rest on my laurels. But not her. After her job was to restructure banks, because she was her expertise was in banking. So she then leaves McKinsey and jumps into the dark, takes a huge risk, and decides to start her own company, and figures she can do this for herself. Well, she's sitting in her accountant's office that she borrowed and wondering whether she made the right decision, because this was in the 80s when startups were not a thing. And startups by women were certainly not a thing. But along comes one guy who she knew from McKinsey, who was restructuring, I think it was Fleet Street Bank, and asked her to help out. And she did such a fantastic job that then there was a long line. So she then ended up restructuring a lot of banks, Riggs, Chase, Manhattan, Bank of Brazil. I mean, a lot of big banks, Republic Bank. And so she became this expertise. So when Indra Nooyi is becoming CEO, she said she had reached the pinnacle. I mean, she said, I've earned so much money, I won't know what to do with it in my lifetime. So she gives it all up, and she decides to go to her original love, which is classical Indian music, and she creates her first record. And it's a fusion jazz Indian classical, and it's nominated for the Grammys. Her first record.
And the question is now, I mean, is this
a completely different field?
And in some ways, that's an extreme example of somebody who's just followed their passion and risen at every level. And in some ways, this is what America offered the Indian immigrants,
exactly.
Because every single person in your book talks about, well...
But let me just finish.
Yes,
so
oh yes.
So she does that, And then this year, she won the Grammys. So you may have heard of her because she won the Grammys this year, but she actually, so this is not a person who does one thing, it's a repeat achiever. She can repeat herself and come back, and that's what genius really is. When you can, it's not a one shot in the dark, you can do it again and again. And then she's a philanthropist. She gave $100 million to NYU to start their engineering school. It's now named after her. So she's done a lot with her life. But anyway, I just wanted to give you this example, and I think you're absolutely right. Let's bring it back to what a lot of the people in my book have said. It was Indian talent, but combined with opportunities in America. And that is what made the magic happen. That's what makes it so great.
And I just have to throw out this image. I don't know how many of you love Abraham Verghese as an author and a physician, and he had an image that he told you that was so striking. He called, when he decided he wants to try being a writer, he got into the Iowa Writers Workshop, and he said, this whole experience is like America is a sandbox. And that whole idea of America being a sandbox for people who have this.
Well, there's no way that in India, if you were a doctor, if you were a physician, that you could then take off 6 months and go to Iowa and try and become a writer and then still maintain your medical profession. I mean, there just isn't a way. People just aren't that, they're very regimented there, so they're not creative enough to allow that to happen. So we wouldn't have had someone who was such a talented writer rise up. But, so yeah, Abraham, and think about Abraham and his determination to become a doctor. It's in my book. But, he didn't get into medical school in India. His older brother, who's an engineer, was like a gold medalist and got into IIT. Abraham didn't.
I'm sorry, gold medalist is a term of art.
When you're a gold medalist, meaning you achieve like big awards and stuff. I mean, his brother was very brilliant mathematician, but he teaches at MIT now. But Abraham didn't get into medical school initially, and then he got into medical school in Africa where he was born, and the Civil War breaks out. So halfway through his medical studies, it's completely disrupted, and he ends up. His parents, in the meantime, saw the troubles in Africa, moved to the US. He comes here, and he's cleaning bedpans in hospitals somewhere in Boston, I think, or New Jersey. And he's almost losing the thread of what he wanted to do with such a passion. But then he finds his way, and it's through books. He comes across a book, Gray's Anatomy. It's one of those books on anatomy. A student leaves it, and he comes across it, and he realizes, I really love medicine. Why am I not pursuing this? And he goes back to India to get his degree. And then he comes back to the US to get his graduate degree. I mean, it was a long road for him, but he was so determined to be a doctor. And look at what a doctor he's become. He's not just become a doctor, but he's become a writer and excelled in so many ways.
I mean, given that that's a great story, especially for the Nantucket Book Festival, because it wasn't even somebody who recommended a book to him. It was such serendipity.
Just
an
leaving
anatomy
it there.
book.
Yeah. But, when we move to the medical professional, I want to give you an example of genius in the sense that what I think of is, and when I talk about genius, I mean, it's a provocative term. How do you define genius? I mean, I'm not someone who is authorized to define genius. As a matter of fact, there was a guy who just won the Nobel Prize, an Indian guy who's a physician, and he met me at a book festival in January, and he came to me and he said, I'm not in your book. And I said, you're right, you're not. I said, you should be, but you are a certified genius because you got the Nobel Prize, so you don't need me to tell you that you're a genius. He said, you have that charlatan Deepak Chopra in your book, and you don't have me. And so I said, hold on a second. There's a reason I have Deepak Chopra in my book. And so I said, listen, why don't you read the book? And then you'll see why I have Deepak Chopra in the book. But I'll tell some of you why I do, because you haven't had a chance probably to read the book, but when you do. So a friend of mine who was the national editor of the Washington Post asked me, he is Indian origin, he asked me, he said, are you going to profile Deepak Chopra? And I said, I don't know. He's sort of kind of, all this kind of, the medicine he practices is a little bit wooey-fooey for me. So he said, you've got it wrong. You've got it totally wrong. And I was like, really? I'm always willing to learn. So he said, listen, he said, I was driving around in the hills of Virginia on a drug stakeout with a policeman. And this was redneck country. This guy was like a Trumpy. And, he was not very educated or refined, and he was complaining about his divorce and his mortgage and his, custody issues. And he was saying, oh man, all the stress from all the drug stakeouts. We were discussing the drug stakeout we were about to do. And then in the middle of driving around in the wilds of Virginia, he pops in a Deepak Chopra tape. And he said, I'm like, what? A Deepak Chopra tape? And he said, how do you know about Deepak Chopra? And this policeman says, oh my God, ever since I came across Deepak Chopra, the man totally settles me. I mean, I found a way to manage my life. The guy totally calms me, especially because I have this high-stress job. And he said, it's great. Just listen to it, man. Just listen to it. So this Indian guy, like listening to it. So he came and told me, he said, it's not just wealthy housewives in Beverly Hills. I mean, this guy has impacted people all across the US. It's not just Oprah Winfrey, it's also people like this. So he said, you have to look into it. So I thought, okay, I'll definitely look into it. But the more I started looking into it, the more I realized how many people's lives he'd impacted. Look, when I came to this country, yoga and meditation were considered hippie things. And today, everyone's grandmother does yoga. I mean, meditation is being, in every block in America, every strip mall has a yoga center. I mean, everywhere meditation is being taught in prisons. It's being taught in high schools in Harlem. So you realize that there's been a huge shift in thinking, and who was responsible. So when I went back into it, I realized Deepak Chopra, as an endocrinologist in Boston, really was the person who, by going on Oprah, writing his books, began to show the country that alternative medicine was something to be seriously considered. And he's the one who legitimized it as a different form of healing. Not necessarily, I don't think he claims that it can cure you of cancer, but I think he talks about it as healing. And so I try and read usually everything someone's written before I go interview them. And like Fareed Zakaria, I read all his 7 books, and Abraham's books and everyone else's. And then I looked at Deepak Chopra and I realized, God, he's written 90 books. I thought, how am I gonna read 90 books, So I didn't read 90 books. This is the only exception in the people I profiled. Everyone else's, I read everything that they've written, but in his case, I read a few. I read a handful. And I realized, actually, I was so taken by them that I have a couple of his books on meditation by my bedside now, and I sometimes refer to them when I'm trying to calm myself, and he's pretty good. And actually, as a person, he's a really lovely guy. He's very approachable. He's not at all stuck up. He's a very humble guy. So he's a very decent man.
That's a tough balance to keep, too, when you're in a hyper-competitive world, coming from India, wanting to succeed greatly and to maintain your confidence, but with humility. I just want to do one thing. I want to give you guys a chance for some questions. Does anybody have a question for Meena. Yes, let's.
Clearly, this first wave of immigrants had the language and the education. When they came, what did they find was the most difficult thing to overcome? Was it religion, culture, the food? And how did they manage to overcome whatever obstacles they came across?
Well, I think some of the obstacles that we discussed was really in their career. And for example, in the tech world, Indians were not seen as managers. They were seen as the backroom guys. They were seen as engineers who could solve problems and do all the backroom work. And so I have one person who I've profiled called Kanwal Rekhi. He's now considered the godfather of the Indians in Silicon Valley. And when he came in the 60s, he said he had a thick accent. He didn't dress particularly well. He came from sort of a poor family. His father was in the military, but he didn't have this sort of more polished background that someone like Satya Nadella has. And he said that he was a real genius in that he figured out, in those days, every computer had a different system of operating. But he figured how to get computers to talk to each other and sort of developed something that was a precursor to the current internet system we have. I'm simplifying it enormously, but I'm not an engineer, so I can't really do any better than that. But if you read it, you can read it in his own words. But he was really, really outstanding. No matter where he worked, he could get all the computers to function, and he could provide a network for them to communicate through, which was quite remarkable at the time. So, but he kept seeing that everyone was being promoted over him. So he went to his boss and he would say, like, what about me? And they just said, oh, you're just indispensable to the firm. You're so great. Just keep doing what you're doing. So he ended up realizing that the only way he was going to circumvent, he said they just weren't seen as front office people, as the face of the company. So he realized so there was that sort of discrimination. But he decided to go start his own company. So he got together with two other guys and started his own company, and initially had real trouble getting any investors because they kept saying, where's your salesperson? And there was a sort of camouflage saying, where's the white guy in your, who's going to be the front? And so finally, one guy liked his idea and gave him a break, and it just took one person. And that person invested and then brought in other people, and he started a company, and it was so successful. He had IBM, and all these people became his clients. And then he was the first Indian that went public, that was listed on NASDAQ. So when they were going to go public, a group of the members of his board said to him, you're not the right, he was CEO, and they said, no, you're not the right front when we're going public. You need to bring in someone else, meaning a white guy. So they went to Hewlett-Packard, got in this guy, and of course he was a complete failure. They went public, they made money, but afterwards, he just didn't know how to run the company, because whenever there's a problem, Bloomberg has something very interesting. I remember once having a conversation with him and someone else about how he structured his office, because they were all cubicles. And he said, I like these cubicles, and I'm also in a cubicle, and the reason is I always know who the most important guy in my office is, because there's always a long line in front of his desk of people asking him to solve their problems. And he said, so I just know who the critical people in my organization are. And so, this guy was one of those sort of critical people in the organizations. But anyway, the Hewlett-Packard guy didn't last. He made a mess of it. He had to leave. And Kanwal then took back this being the CEO and everything else. And many years later, Eric Schmidt, for example, had said that, who ended up buying his company, after it was sold and stuff, said, he said that, life had been a little unfair to him, that people weren't ready at the time. But since he went public, there were 2 or 3 other companies, Sun Microsystems, one of the founders, Vinod Khosla, who's one of the biggest venture capitalists in Silicon Valley today. He's in the book as well. So he helped found Sun Microsystems, but he had gone to Stanford, so his partners were Americans, and so he had an easier time. So I think, some of these people had things that they had to get over with initial discrimination. That's all gone now.
So let me ask you this. So given the struggles, a final question from me, given all those struggles, like as an Indian American community, you want to protect what you've gained and continue advancing for your children. And there is a lot of these stories started with parents who wanted to arrange marriages. And a number of people did reject that. They wanted to find their true love. And what's happening right now in the Indian community? Is there a willingness to accept you can marry anybody you want from love, and it doesn't have to be in the Indian community?
Yeah, no, I think Indians have always been open about that. I think one of the reasons Indians have blended in and assimilated into American life so easily, one, because of English, because they came knowing English. I think the second thing is the Hindu religion doesn't really have the sorts of huge restrictions that, let's say, Islam does, about marrying within your own. It's a more flexible sort of religion. And for a long time, there was a lot of intermarriage, and nobody really objected to it, to be quite honest. I mean, I'm a Hindu. I grew up as a Hindu. I met my husband here. He's a Muslim. That's why my last name is Ahamed. And when I told my mom, when I first told my mom, she said, "Oh, well, because my family was, there were people who had gone through the partition of India in 1947, and our family had actually had massive lands on the Pakistani side, and we had to leave all that and come to India because we were Hindu." And so she said, "Oh, he's a Muslim. We had to leave all our lands behind, and we had to give everything up because of the Muslims." And I said, "Yeah, Mom, but he went to Harvard and to Cambridge University." And she said, "Oh, well, that's all right then." So Indians are like, you just have to know where the soft spot is, and it's education.
Well, on that note of education, I think we're going to have to go. Just last thing, immigration. We started with immigration. Let's just quickly end with immigration. We're in a situation now where a lot of people are not going to be welcome coming in. Funding is being cut for a lot of these research institutions that typically attract a lot of Indians. There's been reporting already that the top graduates from these Indian institutes of technology and medicine are not looking to the U.S. for their major job opportunities. Just in 1 minute,
Right.
Can you tell
Well,
us,
where's that going? There are about 300,000 Indian students here, and a lot of them pay full fare. So, because now India is the 5th largest economy in the world, they're much richer than they used to be. So it is a big loss to the university system here, both financially and in other job-related things. But they had canceled the visas of half of them. I don't know how that's going to go. But what makes this country so great were its educational systems. Look, I mean, the US stopped manufacturing sneakers and T-shirts a long time ago. But what no one can hold a candle to them on is information and technology. The US leads the world in that. And if we start, and even in biotech and medical research, if we start cutting that off and we don't attract the talent that we need to attract, then I think it's going to be a real loss. It'll be make China great again. Because, someone pointed out that in the last few issues of Nature magazine, which is a scientific journal, Harvard was #1 in producing scientific papers, and then there was another American university, and then the next 8 were Chinese institutions. So, how are we helping anything by cutting off what makes America so great?
Well, listen, as immigrants, I think, have always appreciated to a greater degree than anybody what makes America great. So we appreciate you coming here and making the book festival, helping make the book festival great.